When I first got to uni, I was like, am I meant to be here? Like the gatekeeping of like what's good and what's not has been abolished. I also don't think it's a good idea to hold a mirror up to the working class either. It's not about going, hey, you guys look like this, and this is a product for people that look like this. When I was a kid, I used to get in trouble for like breaking things just to see how they worked. Like taking apart watches, opening up the VCR and going, hey, this is cool, and then not knowing how to put it back together again.
Today's guest grew up in a working class family and transformed their passion for creativity into a successful career in advertising. Inspired early on by family and a love for movies, they navigated the media world, overcoming challenges like imposter syndrome while staying true to their roots. Now based in the US, they reflect on how they've balanced their upbringing with a thriving career in the creative industry. With a strong work ethic shaped by their background, they share their journey from a small town life to working with top brands, from juggling jobs during university to discovering their passion for advertising. They've remained grounded while breaking into the creative world. So let's dive into his story. How was that, Rick? Was that all right? Yeah? Is that okay?
That's
yeah.
right.
Cool. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what your current role is?
Yeah, of course. My name's Rick. Grew up in the UK, in Bolton, and sort of moved out to the US probably about 8 years ago, on a little bit of a whim. But we can get into that in a bit. Right now, I'm a brand strategist and have been a brand strategist for about 15, 16 years, working in the ad industry. I work for an ad agency out here in New York, and I've worked with brands all over the world, helping them figure out how to connect with people and sell their products by understanding how people like tick, basically.
Yeah. Okay. So in a nutshell, you're based out in the UK and then pretty much moved over to the US. So
Yeah,
would you say it's quite a bit of a jump between the two cultures?
strangely enough, yes. Like I worked in Manchester, and I worked in London, and I've worked in New York, and there's a lot of similarities, but there's a lot of differences as well. Like the job is still the job, advertising is still advertising. But I think one of the big things that I've noticed since moving from the UK to the US is just how egalitarian it is over here. I think it's a lot more accessible than perhaps other industries are in the UK. It's not as classist. It's definitely a lot more racist, I find, or at least there's a lot more racial undertone in the US than there is in the UK. But overall, I think it's just because there's a lot more money in the business in the US. Everyone takes the business of the business incredibly seriously, whereas I think in the UK there's almost like an acknowledgement that it's a bit of a privilege to be able to spend other people's money creating fun ads that help entertain and sell things to people in entertaining ways. Versus over here, it's like, oh no, like, this is the business of advertising.
Yeah.
We have to dot our I's and cross our T's, and there's an element of that everywhere, but we can't be irresponsible with other people's money.
Yeah.
But I think it's not a job that we're all doing to save humanity. We're here to kind of just try and figure out how to sell things and create the most creative possible.
So this series that I'm doing is about working classes and those from low socio-economic backgrounds getting into industry. So it's quite fascinating what you just said there. So how would you define working class, and has it changed since you going over to the US?
I think the definition of working class is kind of universal. It's essentially doing working classes like doing jobs that aren't skilled, but are essential, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And like they're essential for the people doing it as much as the people that are on the receiving end of it as well. Like, you work because you have to work, and that's what makes you working class. It's not work optional.
Yeah.
Like, you can't put food on the table if you're not working. And I think that definition of working class is like universal across any border. In the US, there's a bunch of people that live here in the land of abundance, as I like to call it, but they have to work to put food on the table. They have to work to pay the bills because there is no social security safety net, and
Yeah,
like there are in other countries. And I think that's working class means it's the class of people that have to work to live. Um, you know, and, and that's it.
In the US, because there isn't really a class system as such. But you said you noticed there's more of a kind of a racial thing. Would you say that it's more prominent in America because there isn't this kind of class system in
Um,
play?
there's like a pseudo class system. Like, America's always been built on these ideals of egalitarianism, of like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Anybody can make it. The American dream.
Yeah.
It's sort of the thing that made the states quite attractive to a lot of people. Is like, you don't doesn't matter where you come from. It matters what you do and how you do it, and those things will determine your success. But there's still some gatekeeping, and I see classism as like a series of gates that are kept by a group of individuals or a collective of individuals that all acknowledge that we do this thing because we want to help each other out, and we don't want other people to also do the same thing as us. And that's how it felt in the UK. Like, when you're trying to like move up through different social classes, there's like there's an unwritten rule of like people from a certain background or people from a certain school or people that associate with each other from a particular sort of community aren't as worthy of other people's time as perhaps the people that came from a different one. And I think there's less of that. At least there's less of it publicly here in the States. It still exists.
Okay. It's more
exists,
of an undercurrent kind of thing.
Yeah, but I'd say it was more of a meritocracy than anything else, because the country is much more driven by money and greed than it is by sort of it's like a different type of stats, right? It's just a little bit.
Yeah.
It's a little bit more like how big's your bank balance versus like how big is your power of influence. And I think that's the difference between like how classism shows up in the UK versus in the US. It's about chasing paper over here versus in the UK. It's like, who do you know that like can help me get around this problem? Or like, it's a old boys club type mentality.
I suppose it's a bit like when you look at the American politics, it's like who's got the biggest donors.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose it's kind of on par with that, would you say? And what made you go into the kind of the advertising route? Tell us your journey a bit there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't think I ever grew up going, I want to make ads. I, like most people, thought I was going to do a bunch of other stuff before I ended up in the business that I'm in right now. But I think from a young age, I've always been quite enamored by films. My grandparents used to have like a little video rental shop, and I used to love watching films over the summer holidays and like half term and stuff like that. I like have VHSs stacked up to the ceiling, and like, it was something that I just thought was incredible, and I wanted to kind of get into that side of things, get into filmmaking, get into the creative industry through that avenue. But I don't think I was really good at like writing stories, but I was quite good at like solving problems and observing things that I just thought were odd and asking why. And I got like, I didn't know advertising was a career that you could pursue, if I'm being quite honest, until I got exposed to it by my at the time it was my uncle's girlfriend, and she was working at Disney,
Yeah.
and I got like a an opportunity to do some work experience, and she kind of exposed me to like this concept of marketing, which I'd never come across before.
Mm.
And it was just fun to see like you can take a lot of the academic stuff that you learn in school, but apply it in creative ways. And um, I was like, this might be like something that I could pursue and could be good at. And it reminded me a lot of like the types of jobs that I used to have as well. So like I grew up working through school and stuff like that. So I worked in sales roles,
Yeah.
in retail and stuff like that. And I was just like, marketing is basically sales at scale,
Yeah.
and like trying to figure out how to convince someone to buy something that they've been on the fence about. It's not about like blagging someone into doing something they don't want to do as much as it's trying to convince someone that, yeah, okay, you know, if this is what you want to do, maybe you should do it with this brand or with this business over here.
Yeah.
Um, so I got a taste for it when I was at like sixth form,
Yeah.
and I was like, oh, this is quite cool. Um, Decided to take like media studies and business at sixth form. I wasn't too sure where it would go. I thought I was going to go and pursue maths and physics at uni,
Mm.
or film, and ended up like taking a marketing degree. And then when I got to uni, I got exposure to like even more people that came from different backgrounds that perhaps had different working experience to me, and started to learn about ad agencies, and got some experience working in ad agencies. And that's kind of when I made the decision. I think this is what I want to do, because it was fun. It's like someone comes to you and goes like, we don't really know how to sell this brandy to people that
Mm.
don't really like brandy. How do you convince them that brandy's worth like trying? Or how do you sell this car that nobody knows exists? And how do you do it in a way that makes them feel like it's something for them? And I just thought that was like a really fun thing to do, because it's like there's no right answer. And I think growing up in a working class family, you're kind of like, there's rules, and it's like very binary. Like, the
Mm.
right answer is this and the wrong answer is that.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden you're exposed to a world where it isn't binary. Two truths can be true at the same time. And like, you can just sort of experiment and play and sort of see how it goes. And that's what made me kind of quite attracted to the business, and wanted to seek out like a job in the ad industry. So like when I got to uni, um, I started looking for jobs in marketing at first. Took a year out, worked at a car company, and learned that I think I want to work on the agency side rather than the client side, because the agency side seemed to be a little bit more fun, because it had more variety.
Yeah.
Like one day you could be selling cars, another day you could be selling chocolate, another day you could be selling insurance.
Yeah.
Um, and it was filled with people from all walks of life. Like you had like, you know, sort of statistic nerds who are like really into research and crunching
Mm.
numbers, working with like account people who are there, like, amazing salespeople, and like this creative department which is like full of like comedy writers and artists and people that were like frustrated filmmakers that couldn't figure out how to make film but knew how to make a 30-second spot.
Yeah.
And you all get together and you solve like a problem together. And I thought that was quite fun. And the fact that you got paid for it was even better. I was just like, okay.
It's always a bonus, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's quite interesting that you went that route. Because as our viewers have known, I interviewed your brother a
Yeah.
couple episodes ago. So yeah, Jay's your brother, and he went the graphic design creative route, and because you were quite academically, you were pretty academically good at like you mentioned, you did maths and physics, and would you say that's kind of why you went more the role and route that you're doing now because of that side of things?
Perhaps. Yeah. I think my brother's always been quite gifted with his hands. Like he's like been quite crafty. He's always like been good at drawing and designing and stuff like that. I've never really been good at that. I've always been good at like I suppose blagging and like spotting patterns
Hmm.
and like asking questions.
Just generally
And
quite curious natured.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I'm like, well, why does it have to do that? Or why can't it be this way? Or wouldn't it be cool if you did it this way? And looked at it from a different angle. I always like when I was a kid, I used to get in trouble for like breaking things just to see how they worked.
Yeah.
Like taking apart watches, opening up the VCR and going, "Hey, this is cool," and then not knowing how to put it back together again. Whereas my brother was really good at like he was into fashion, he was into like design, he was into music, and he was just always like a little bit more creative than I was, but in a
Yeah.
different way.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think maybe the reason that I went into the sort of part of the creative industry that I've kind of found myself in right now is because it scratched that itch of like being able to ask questions for a living.
Hmm.
I get paid to think.
This is the thing with advertising. I think some people probably have a bit of a cynical view about it, but
Yeah,
I suppose in your line of work, you can see a product that could be beneficial to people. And would you say?
I think the job requires me to find what the silver lining is.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, it requires me to figure out how to convince a business to spend money telling people about something that they might not agree with because the
Yeah.
business thinks that what they're in the business of doing it might be different to what people think that they need out of that business. Um, because at the end of the day, people don't need more stuff. The last
Yeah.
thing people need is more stuff. But what people need is solutions to their problems. And sometimes businesses don't think beyond their nose a little, and are obsessed with with whatever it is that they're selling, and haven't figured out which problems they're solving for like specific people. Like
Yeah.
usually it solves a problem, but is the problem a real problem or is it a problem that people have made up?
Hmm.
And I think a lot of the time it's just trying to figure out like how do we solve a business problem and a people problem at the same time.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't think it's a bad thing that people are skeptical about the business of advertising. I think people should be skeptical of
Hmm.
the ad industry because it's essentially there to try and sell you stuff.
Yeah. Don't take it
Um,
face value.
don't take it at face value. Don't
Yeah.
take it at face value. I implore everyone to apply a bit of critical thinking.
Yeah.
But it's like a story as old as time. As long as there's been someone wanting to sell something, there's always been someone trying to figure out how to sell it to people that don't need it.
Yeah.
And like I think the world that we live in right now and the machinery that's been built around the advertising industry makes it a little bit more icky.
Yeah.
Like leveraging people's phone data or following people around the internet, and almost annoying people into buying something
Yeah.
rather than like you know nudging people into buying something. And I think they're two different things.
Yeah.
Like do forcing people to do it because you've not given them a choice versus making them feel like they've they've come to their own conclusions by themselves.
Coming from like your working class roots and stuff, does it ever feel like, because traditionally I think people from a working class background are probably a bit more frugal,
Yeah.
and do you, because you are selling products to people fundamentally, does it ever feel like it kind of goes against your grain sometimes?
Um, it depends. Like I've always made a concerted effort not to work on brands and businesses that I think are actually harming people. I'll
Mm.
never work on e-cigarettes. Will never work on gambling brands. I've never really been a big fan of like advertising pharmaceuticals. I think it's the job of the doctor to
Yeah.
figure out what drugs and medicine you should have, not like the businesses that make the medicines and the drugs.
Mm.
Um, I think there's certain things that that don't need to be sold because they're necessities and they're like vices that people should sort of come to the conclusion of whether it's good or not by themselves rather than be
Yeah.
convinced that it's something that's for them or not. But the working class nature of like, yes, you're right, there is an element of frugality of working class um, folk where you're limited with resources. You have to kind of make sure that you spend your money in the right way so you don't end up spending twice. And that's kind of how I look at the business that I'm in, is like
Mm.
trying to figure out the right people that should find the brand or the business that I'm selling on behalf of. Because there's my I remember reading this somewhere. Like, if you buy cheap, you buy twice, and I think working class folk
Yeah.
can sometimes fall into the trap of going for the cheapest option, but end up sort of
Paying more in the long
paying
run.
more over the long run. It
Yeah.
reminds me of that. There's an episode of Only Fools and Horses where Trig talks about how he's getting an award for the most frugal street sweeper because he's had the same broom for the last 20 years. But when he when they're asking him questions, he's like, "Yeah, it's the same broom. I've changed the handle 14 times, and then I've changed the head like 6 times." It's like it's not the same. It's not the
It's not
same
the same
broom.
room. Yeah.
But it's that I think is sometimes um, not something that the working class um, environment allows you to sort of fully appreciate. Is like, yeah, it might the outlay might be expensive to start off with, but in the long
Mm.
run, it might be worth it. And I think that's just because of the circumstances. Sometimes you
Yeah.
just don't have the money to spend on things that you need over the long run, and you just need to get whatever can do the job in the moment. But it's never created a crisis of conscience, if that's what you're asking. Like, as my working class background and coming up in a family which has had to like watch where they spend their money, made me think
Yeah.
differently about the business that I'm in and how I talk to people. It doesn't make me feel guilty about what I do, but it does make me feel like there's a level of responsibility that I'm not here to rip people off as much as I'm here to kind of figure out what problems they have and how what this
Yeah.
business has to offer solves a real problem for them, and not try to act in a predatory way. Like, I've worked for like the world's biggest bank, and one of the things we made sure was like, let's not turn buying things with your credit card and getting points and getting cash back and those types of things. Don't
Yeah.
gamify it, because if you gamify it, it makes people think that they should spend more money and rack up debt so that they can get points and cash back. When really, it's more of a sort of benefit for people who can afford it, and try and make sure that you do so in a responsible way. Same, I've worked on beer brands. It's not about drinking more beer to have more fun, as much as it's about reminding people that when you are going to reach for a beer, think of this beer.
Yeah. I suppose, like, when you put it like that, it will alleviate that level of cynicism and skepticism about the advertising world, because I think if you are taking the responsible approach and not just thinking about, oh, I've got to sell the big idea and bring the money in, but you're being a bit more responsible about it, then I suppose it does change the attitude of people looking at advertising in the long run.
Yeah, I mean that's my perspective, and
Yeah.
that's the ethics I kind of work by. I wouldn't want my parents to be missold something,
Mm.
knowing that the struggles that like they've endured in their lives, and I've had to work through growing up. But not everybody looks at it from that perspective. Like I
Yeah.
said, depending on where you're in the where in the world you're working in this industry, it can change. There's a lot of regulations in place in places like Europe and the UK. Um, it's a little less regulated in the US, so you kind of have to self-regulate. You kind of have to
Yeah.
you have to make a concerted effort to make sure everyone's being honest.
The working class within the UK in advertising, do you ever feel like they're represented within, like, say you watch a television advert, do you feel like working classes are actually represented? Because I know there is more of a conscious effort now. Um, you hear about companies trying to
Yeah,
incorporate more working class values into pieces of work.
it's an interesting question. It's interesting in that like I think a lot of advertising does try to appeal to the working class. Um, I don't think a lot of advertising represents the working class
Yeah,
in the right way, and I think part of that is because um, it's an idea of what people think the working class is, um, and it also depends on the people that are working behind the scenes. Like if you don't have
mm.
people representing the working class voice behind the camera or in the writing room or in the boardroom, then you're not going to see that story played out in an effective way,
Yeah,
um, or a convincing way. And I also don't think it's a good idea to hold a mirror up to the working class either. It's not about going, hey, you guys look like this, and this is a product for people that look like this, as much as
yeah,
it's trying to understand what makes people um, of a certain group that share a similar mindset, that share a certain lifestyle, feel like they've been seen. And I think that's different to simply showing a working class family. It's not like putting Shameless
yeah,
on a 30-second TV ad and going, "Hey, the
yeah,
guys from Shameless drink cider, and the guys from Coronation Street drink bitter."
yeah,
It's like it's trying to find a way to kind of toe the line in a way that feels like it's reflective, but not not sort of undermining who you are.
yeah.
It's about respecting the working class, and I don't think the industry has ever really been good at doing that with a level of consistency and honesty. And
Mm.
part of that comes from it's a business that a lot of working class people don't know exist, or they know it exists but can't get into because they don't know how to
Yeah.
get into it.
Coming back to your kind of journey, then, would you say you were quite fortunate the fact that you had someone within your family working at Disney? If if that opportunity never came about, do you think you'd be where you are now, or where do you think you'd be?
Um, it's a hard question to answer because, like, yeah, I think I'm definitely fortunate for having had that exposure.
Hmm.
Would I have ended up in this industry if I hadn't been exposed to it by family? Um, maybe. Um, maybe I would have ended up in this business, but it would have been a longer way in.
Yeah,
Like, you know, I don't think I don't think it's something that you kind of seek out as much as you fall into. Like it's a business filled with like misfits. We're not quite consultants. We're not quite creatives. We're not
Hmm.
quite like it's just where misfits go because they aren't too sure what they should and shouldn't do. So I
Yeah.
think it's so I've always seen myself as a bit of a misfit, and didn't feel like I belonged where I belonged when I was growing up, but never felt like I belonged where I ended up in the world, even like right now. Like there's a degree of imposter syndrome that kind of follows you around. It's like, am I meant to be in this room?
Yeah.
Um, and so, like when you ask the question of, yes, I do think I'm fortunate. Would I have ended up in this business if I didn't have that exposure from a young age? Maybe, but I think I might have ended up in a similar type of field
Yeah.
in that like it would have been a field that allows me to like pursue my curiosity in a way that allows me to solve problems creative in creative ways.
I suppose because if you've got this natural curiosity, you would have kind of searched out, oh, what role is this that kind of fits my general outlook?
Yeah,
I suppose, yeah.
yeah, I think so. I think so because I think you kind of you find things that like you find things that you're good at, but also you feel good doing.
Mm.
And like I've always been good at talking to people, which is why I've worked in restaurants and bars and worked in retail
Yeah.
and like worked in places where like you get to interact with people. So it's only natural that I ended up in a business that relies on understanding people.
Mm.
And like the skills that I possess might not have led me to advertising if I wasn't in if I wasn't exposed when I was exposed to the like creative field of marketing and stuff like that. But like I might have ended up in another place. It might have been like social services where I'm solving people's
Yeah.
problems by figuring out how a system works, or going in teaching, like
Yeah.
helping people like see the world from a different light. Like I think the skills that I have would have led me to a field that allows me to exercise them in different ways. It might not necessarily have been advertising.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that I haven't had a chance to realize until I've gotten older. It was like the creative industry doesn't necessarily mean you need to be an artist
Mm.
or a sort of filmmaker or a photographer. It helps, and
Yeah.
yes, the creative industry predominantly sells those types of things. But there's so many other jobs within the creative industry that people do that aren't necessarily the act of making things as much as it's the act of trying to figure out how to sell the things that have been made, or the act of trying to figure out like what people think and like create systems around those things. And
Yeah.
I don't think that I fully appreciated that until I started to get into the business of it all. Um, and I think if more people knew that, I think more people would pursue it,
Yeah.
um, because there's a lot of opportunity there. And I think social media has kind of played a big role in kind of pulling back the curtain on all of that sort of stuff, where people
Mm.
have started to create their own podcasts, create their own
Yeah.
social content, and it's all just like people talking about things that they know about in to people who want to know about it, and trying to figure out how to find them and
Yeah.
how to connect with them.
So are you finding more people from different backgrounds that wouldn't necessarily have known about this industry are kind of finding their way into it now?
Yeah, yeah. I think more and more the curtain has been dropped, as like the platforms that allow people to sell things have become a lot more accessible.
Yeah.
Um, like historically, you learn about holidays through teletext or
Yeah.
like by going down to the travel agents, and now you hear about it by watching someone's Instagram,
Mm.
and seeing the photos that they've got online, and then like word of mouth kicks in. You learn about certain brands because they were on TV, at a certain time,
Yeah.
when or in the newspaper, or but all of those like media platforms are no longer the only places where you can learn about those things.
Yeah.
Um, and like social media has kind of definitely accelerated people's ability to learn more and get access to more things. That the gatekeeping of like what's good and what's not has been abolished
Yeah.
to a point where like you can find whatever you want as long as you know what it is that you want to look for, versus you only know what you're exposed to.
Yeah. So it's a much more like level playing field, would you say now then?
Yeah,
Yeah.
which is good and bad, because it also means that people that are doing it to exploit people and pull the wool over people's eyes,
Mm.
there's more of those people, and there's
Yeah.
also more people sharing what they think is awesome. I came across this guy maybe about 6 months ago on Instagram and TikTok. He's called like his hashtag Brady. He's like a just a lad
Mm.
that's decided that they're going to make videos, and like I think he started off reviewing burgers in different cities across the country, and then finding the best place to get a Guinness from, and now he's traveling the world and like using TikTok and YouTube to kind of like fuel his lifestyle. And that probably would never have happened 20, 30 years ago, but it happens now.
Yeah.
And like I think, yeah, that those types of things is what like gives me hope that like the business has to get better, because if the business doesn't get better, then um, you know people are going to show the business that they can do it in a better way,
Mm.
um, because they understand real people.
Yeah. I suppose as well, it enables a lot of people from working class and low socioeconomic backgrounds more of a avenue for them as an individual as opposed to then joining a company.
Yeah, there's a guy I used to work with. He set up a sort of collective called 100 Roses, 100 Concrete Roses, I think it's called, and it's about basically people from like what I would consider like non-traditional working class backgrounds getting together to kind of share their stories about how they've gotten into the business, but also like lift each other up and
Yeah.
represent each other. Um, and I think about like you know friends in the UK that have gone on like you to create platforms like this to give people a bit more exposure
Mm.
to the fact that this sort of stuff exists, or like companies like the agency that you and I used to work at, setting up like an academy that allows people to get into the advertising industry without necessarily needing a degree.
Yeah.
Like VCCP setting up the Stoke Academy was like something that I thought was an incredible thing for them to do.
Mm.
Recognizing that like there's a lot of untapped creative potential that is like there for the there for the taking, and opportunities aren't being given to people because they might not have enough money to go to university, or they might not um, have a clue about which degree to pursue in order to open the doors that lets them into this type of business. So they're
Yeah.
kind of short circuiting the system.
Yeah, no, I think that's quite valid because I think sometimes people think to get into these roles, you do need to be going to university, but you don't have to. I think, especially with creative
Yeah,
industries, you get people from all walks of life and they can showcase things that you wouldn't necessarily have thought of. And
I mean,
yeah.
let's be honest, you can learn pretty much anything you want to learn on the internet these days. You don't
Mm,
necessarily need to rack up $30,000 or 25 grand's worth of debt.
yeah.
Like you can you could probably learn everything by going to a library, or like finding some free courses online. I think what university has taught me is, or at least when I reflect on what university taught me, is a bit of like independent living, independent learning, and also just like trying like meeting people with different perspectives and learning that
Yeah.
you all have to get on. And I think that's something that is valuable for anybody.
Mm.
I think the working when you come out of a working class community, you can almost get trapped in your own bubble.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like everyone thinks in a very specific way, and everyone
Mm.
does this, goes to the same pubs, they all go to the same restaurants, they all hang out in the same places, and all of a sudden, like, you aren't exposed to new ideas. And I
Yeah.
think that's one of the things that I like why I think I would have ended up in a business like I have right now is because like I've always been curious about what else there is. It's like everyone's doing the same thing, but there's a bunch of people over there doing something different, and just
Yeah.
being curious about it. Or like it's like when we met and we used to live together at uni. Like we really enjoyed watching foreign films,
Yeah.
and like not because foreign films are better or worse than films made in English, but just because like a horror in French or a horror in Japanese or Korean, like is just as scary but for different reasons, or
Yeah. Yeah.
just as funny but for different reasons. And what makes it funny, and like it's just
Yeah.
like
It's
open yourself
slight.
up to new ideas.
Yeah. It's just a different perspective on how they approach it, and
Yeah,
yeah, it just opens your horizons to that. And yeah,
yeah,
no, I get what you mean. In my intro, I mentioned about your imposter syndrome.
yeah,
Could you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think throughout all industries, regardless of being creative, I think there's always that level of imposter syndrome with everyone, and I think not that many people really talk about it.
yeah,
Could you tell us a little bit about your situation with that?
yeah. I think I don't like I don't like imposter syndrome for a number of reasons, but we should all acknowledge that it exists,
Hmm.
but not use it as a crutch. And by that, what I mean is when I first moved to London, um, when I first got to uni, I was like, "Am I meant to be here?" Because there was like,
Yeah.
I was like, me and my brother were probably the first people in our like sort of family to actually go to uni. Like my mum's cousins and stuff did, but like I'm talking about like on my dad's side, like
Yeah.
we it wasn't something that we did. It was like you know you go to school, you get a job, and you work, and then you get married, and then you
Yeah.
have an house, you buy a house, and then you have kids. It's just like that was life.
Yeah.
Um, so like you get to uni and everything's a little bit scary because you're like, what uh, I do for the next 3 years is going to determine what I do for the next 30,
Yeah.
or how much money is this actually going to cost me? Can I actually do this? Am I smart enough to be here? And I think that
Mm.
stuff follows you.
Yeah.
Um, like the imposter syndrome comes from the unknown, like
Yeah.
because you're put in a place where you don't know what the outcome should be because no one's told you about what the outcome should be. You start to doubt whether you should be there in the first place. And I think everyone should have a healthy sense of sort of skepticism about their own abilities to the point that it makes you want to make sure you've done the right thing.
Yeah.
But sometimes too much can actually be a bad thing
Yeah.
and
Too much of a
ruin it's like
hindrance.
self-sabotaging.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I remember going into university and learning about like you know weird and wonderful concepts that were essentially just like common sense when you like break it down.
Yeah.
Um, and like I think academia has a very very sort of interesting way of making common sense things feel complicated by over theorizing things. And I
Yeah.
think business does the same thing. And business situations like try to put systems in place that codify like very simple things like the job of a strategist, for instance, is to figure out what the real problem is that's stopping the business from growing and
Mm.
what the human problem is, the people problem is that stops them from doing something that they want to do and finding the overlap of those two things.
Yeah.
Um, but like when you go into when you go into an ad agency, they'll talk about it as like big lofty goals and purpose and like unmet needs and motivations, and like it's all fluff that basically
Yeah.
just is a different way of saying like we need to figure out what causes a problem for these people and how we can solve it for them,
Yeah.
and how we tell it to them in a way that is that's something that they remember. And I think the language around that and the systems around that and the processes around that, when you've never been introduced to it before,
Yeah.
can make you think like, what the fuck am I doing here? Like they've just, have I been invited into the right meeting?
Yeah.
Like I don't know what that buzzword means. I don't know what that I don't know how that process works.
Yeah.
And all of that, if you listen to that voice too much, it'll convince you that you're not meant to be in that room.
Mm.
But if you listen to that voice and go, okay, I don't know what that is, and be confident enough to own the fact that you don't know what it is,
Yeah.
I think that helps you get over the imposter syndrome. And that, I think, took me a while, is like being able to admit when you don't know something is actually a superpower, not a weakness.
Yeah.
Not knowing something means that like you can bring a level of naivety to the conversation that actually helps the conversation move forwards, because it forces people to simplify what they're saying into like layman's terms so
Yeah.
everybody understands, rather than like talking in code or like, you know, business jargon,
Yeah.
um, that only a few people understand.
And there's probably like people in that same room that would probably have the same thoughts, but too
Yeah,
afraid to say. It's like being at school when a teacher asks you a question, you know the answer, but you're afraid to say anything in case you end up
yeah,
looking a bit of a fool.
yeah. I think imposter syndrome affects people who are too afraid to say I don't know,
Hmm.
and I think it affects everybody at some point, because at some
Yeah.
point someone's going to face a situation where they don't want to admit that they don't know. Um, but like the sooner you admit that you don't know, the the less power the imposter syndrome will have over you.
Yeah. We're coming towards the end of it. Is there any like last bits of advice or words of wisdom you would say?
Nobody knows everything. Don't be worried about asking
Yeah.
questions. I think one of the things that I love about my working class background is like I knew I didn't know everything.
Mm.
I knew what I knew based on what I'd experienced, but I knew that I didn't know everything because I've never done everything.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, sometimes you can use your working class background as a reason for why you don't succeed, or you can use your working class background as a reason for why you should succeed. And like just reminding yourself of like being working class is not bad.
Mm.
Being working class, if anything, makes you like more normal than most.
Yeah.
Like you know what it's like to, you know, struggle. You know what it's like to have to work to put food on the table. And if you just
Mm.
remember that, like everything else becomes a bit of a privilege, and
Yeah.
you treat it as such, not with so much reverence. That it's like, oh, it's a privilege. I'm there to do my best job. As much as it's like you treat it with the fact that like I'm lucky to do this,
Mm.
and I should enjoy doing it and try to do it in the best way possible. And I think that's something that I've learned as I've gotten older, is like, you know, my therapist and I talk about this quite a lot, about like certain things serve you to a point. And I used to use the fact that I was from a working class background,
Okay.
to undermine myself and disarm people to give me
Mm.
an opportunity to talk. And that worked to a point until I got to a leadership position where I had
Yeah.
to show off a sort of a level of strength that requires me not to like undermine myself.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that I don't appreciate the working class background that I came from. So my parting words would be like, being working class is not bad. Um, it makes you quite normal, and just remember a lot of what people do outside of the working class, sort of normal jobs, aren't actually that fucking normal.
Yeah.
And more normal people need to be asking, why are we doing this? Who is it for?
Yeah.
What does this mean? And I think the more of those questions that are asked, and the more that they're answered in simple terms, the better everyone will be. I think it'll help you move forwards and get that social mobility that everyone's looking for.
Yeah. No, it's good. No, I'm really grateful for this conversation. Really insightful. I think there's a lot of like key points in there, and I think it's quite interesting how you talk about how you have a responsibility because you work in advertising and you got your own moral compass, I suppose, in what work you work on and stuff like that. So I think it's quite interesting because I think a lot of people will have this level of skepticism towards advertising, but I think
they should.
Yeah. No, and
don't
it's
believe
good.
the bullshit.
Yeah. But no, I think you've highlighted some really good key points, and you've been quite open and honest in terms of your imposter syndrome, and it's quite fascinating. I think people watching this, it might give them a bit of a kick up the arse to be like, actually, no, it's not necessarily a bad thing, and no, it's good like that. You can be quite brutally honest about that. But yeah, so no, thanks again. Do you have any like socials or anything that people could reach out to you or anything like that?
Fairly inactive on social. I'm more of a lurker than anything else.
Yeah.
But I'm on LinkedIn. I think that's probably the most active that I am on. So I'm up on there. You can find me as Rikesh Mystery on LinkedIn.
Okay, cool.
If people want to reach out and ask me questions and want to know more about how to get into advertising or
cool. Not. Cool. Thanks again for that, man. Really appreciate it, and hopefully people will get a lot from this.
Thanks, man.
Cool. Cheers. Thanks for tuning into this episode of Initial Step. If you resonate with the stories we share and have a similar background you'd like to talk about, we'd love to hear from you. Get in touch and maybe you'll be featured in an upcoming episode. Don't forget to like, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. And be sure to check out our previous episodes for more inspiring stories. And until next time, I'll see you on the next one.